We're glad that you're on, and appreciate you being with us as we study a series. And really, this particular series is designed to strengthen our faith, to fortify our faith. And we've been looking at science and the Bible, and trying to look at maybe some of the things that are being taught, especially in schools, to children. And what does the Bible say about that? Does it have anything to say about it? Is the Bible really inaccurate? Is it wrong? Is science right and the Bible wrong? What do we need to do with this information that our children are receiving? Well, that's really what this series is designed to help us with. This class particularly is designed to help us with, is to strengthen our faith and for us to understand that the Bible is inspired, that it is accurate, scientifically, historically, prophetically. It is very accurate, perfectly accurate. And so that's why we study all of this, to try to help us and to strengthen our faith. Give me just a moment, see if I can transition over here. There we go. You can look at my ugly face now. Let me see if I can get back over here. It's kind of a challenge trying to run all this all at one time. I will tell you, I have a great appreciation for our brethren, men that are up here in the crow's nest, helping with our worship service. I appreciate you. It's hard to do. I had to do it the other day, and I was missing transitioning the slides during the song because I know the song, and I was just singing along, and then I was like, oh, I missed a transition. So appreciate everybody that's doing that. It's not an easy job. It's very, very challenging, and I appreciate them doing that for us. Now, often that's the case that people, going back to our lesson now. If the Bible is from God, prove it, often is what is claimed or said. And instead of individuals trying to aim at the cross per se, what they're instead aiming at is a belief in God altogether. You would never believe in the Son if you don't believe in the Father, God the Father. And so they're trying to say, well, there is no God and we have no need for it. And so they're trying to use a lot of different ways to creep into movies and textbooks and a lot of different ways to take our belief away from God. And they've used for a long time to try to get us to believe that there is this idea of separation of church and state. And what they mean is, we don't want you to teach anything religious, anything that has to do with God. Matter of fact, we need you to take it out. Take out school prayer, take out biblical references, take out anything that has to do with Ten Commandments. Take it out. Get it far away, because they don't believe in creation. They don't believe in God, and they want it rid. They want it completely taken away from anything that has to do with our country. And it's very unfortunate, because our country was based upon Judeo-Christian principles, and especially upon biblical principles. And so to take that away, you really don't have the foundation upon which our Constitution is even founded. And that's a sad thing. But there's a reason why they want to do that, want to take it all out of there, so that then they can put in this evolutionary theory so that they can breed atheists for the future, not believers in God. And it is very sad. We see that growing more and more. We have more people that are not even in a religious category. We call them the unchurched. That group is growing. And actually atheism, and those that are atheists, are growing. And it's because we've allowed this type of education and to enter into the secular field, and we've removed anything that has to do with true morality in God. We've taken it away. Now, Charles Smith says this about the beginning, trying to explain how we got here. And really, it's a sorry excuse for an explanation of how we got here. And I don't know anybody that would want to say, well, this is where I come from. If I was wanting to give my genealogy or to try to give my heritage, I certainly wouldn't want to say, well, you know, I come from this slime over here, or this one-celled amoeba. That is my heritage. And for those that understand the Bible, we can say we have God as our heritage from the standpoint that we've been created in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. And because of that, that is the heritage that we have, and that's what gives true value to life, true meaning to human life. But when you take away that, value and that meaning, then you can see why people would abort babies and say there's no value there whatsoever. It's not really of any value any more than stepping on an earthworm or crushing a cricket or something like that, or squashing a cockroach. That's a sad truth, but that is the reality of it. And here's the definition. He says, in the beginning was matter, which begat the amoeba, which begat the worm, which begat the fish, which begat the amphibian, which begat the reptile, which beget the lower mammal, which beget the lemur, which beget the monkey, which beget the man who imagined God. This is the genealogy of man. And that is often, at least in principle, what is being taught to our young people. But what does the Bible say? Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. That's what the Bible teaches. In the beginning, God. He is the Creator. And in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 11, it says, in 6 days, the Lord made it all, the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Everything was created by God in 6 days. So looking at a couple of different things, what we've been doing is we've been presenting what often may be misconstrued or what is taught falsely. We're presenting a fact and trying to ask some questions to those that have been taught and do believe atheism. And so the fact number one that we want to begin our lesson with tonight is that life does not and cannot come from dead matter, something that is dead, that doesn't have any life whatsoever. Life cannot come out of that. Now, throughout the years, there have been those that have claimed that and those that have tried to say, well, it does, but they have been proven wrong, especially using various scientific methods. Let me give you an example. They said, well, spontaneous generation is the answer. That's where we got life from. It just spontaneously generated from nothing. We got life from nothing. And that was something that was purported as a scientific fact, that this is where life has come from. Well, we read about, and we can go and read, you can even Google spontaneous generation for that matter, and you can read a little bit about where some of the ideas of spontaneous generation would come from Aristotle and some of the beliefs that go back. But you read about some of the experiments and individuals that were involved in proving that wasn't correct. And one of those was Francesco Redi in the 1600s. I believe it was 1668 is around the time that he was involved in this. And so he challenged that theory of spontaneous generation. And he said that maggots are not just spontaneously generating from this dead meat. See, that was the idea. Here's dead meat, and then all of a sudden we get these maggots, and so we're having this meat that's dead. There's no life in it. This rotting dead carcass of meat, no life there, and we're getting life from that. And that maggots are coming out of that, and so dead matter is producing life. That's spontaneous generation. And so Reddy decided that he was going to provide a controlled experiment, and if I'm not mistaken, he used a couple of jars, and he put meat in one, he left the jar open, he put meat in the other, and he closed the jar. And so, of course, on the one that was open, then you had the flies coming in and laying their eggs, and here comes the maggots. But on the one that was closed, nothing. And so he was able to disprove that these maggots actually were coming from the eggs of the flies that they were laying. It didn't come from something that was dead. And so, again, with true science, we're going to prove not this naturalistic evolution that is outside of God, but we're going to prove truly that there is only a one true Creator God. Another is that, fact number 3, life does not come from dead matter. There was another gentleman who was the director of the Rouen Museum of Natural History. And this gentleman stated that air everywhere could spontaneously generate living organisms in liquid. And so the air was what was producing this, and it was spontaneously generating life. Well, thankfully, Louis Pasteur came along and challenged that idea. So there's a lot of people that did it. And so with Louis Pasteur, he had a different type of experiment that he performed. And he used what would be considered, it's like this flask, it's round, and then it has this little swan neck on it, okay? Let me try this way so you can see it on the video. It has this little swan neck on it, and he had 2 of those, all right? So he had some of this material, this nutrient broth, that he put inside of it, and he was able to sterilize, basically heat up and sterilize both of them so that there's nothing in there. And on one of them, he left this little crooked neck thing on this flask, and on the other, he broke it off so that it was open. And what he found out was that the bacteria couldn't grow in that little swan-necked flask, but it was certainly able to grow in the one that was open. And so he was able to disprove through this process that, again, spontaneous generation, that is, coming from the air, was a false belief. And so he was able to show that life doesn't come from dead matter or something that is not living. And we know a lot about Louis Pasteur. Actually, some of the most important experiments disproving the theory of spontaneous generation were done by him, and there was another gentleman as well. I can't remember his name, but there are several different ones that had performed various experiments to be able to disprove these items. And so he proved that particles in the air caused bacteria. And so very, very important part of science to show that life just doesn't spontaneously generate from non-life, but that was a belief for a long time. So how can science teach that life began from dead matter? Well, that's a good question. Isn't this a return to the disproved theory of spontaneous generation? If that's what they're saying, that we got here and that life came from dead matter, which is what they're going to have to say, either there was a creator that started life or life evolved from dead matter that's not living, one or the other, then they're going back to a disproven, false theory of spontaneous generation. And so isn't it scientifically provable that living organisms only come from other living organisms? The answer to that question is yes. And so it's very important. Another one of the laws that has come through science is the law of biogenesis. Very important law. That is, life only comes from already established life. Now, there's a gentleman that wrote in the Science Digest, and he was speaking on genes on ice. His name is Martin Moe, and he was an evolutionist, and this is what he said. He said, "A century of sensational discoveries in the biological sciences has taught us that life arises only from life, that the nucleus governs the cell throughout the molecular mechanisms of DNA, and that the amount of DNA in its structure determine not only the nature of the species, but also the characteristics of individuals." You know, it's interesting in the middle of that he admits that life only arises from life. And that's something that is very important. Life arises only from life, and this is an evolutionist stating this. Now another evolutionist, George Gaylord Simpson, said, "There is no serious doubt that biogenesis is the rule, that life comes only from other life, that a cell, the unit of life, is always and exclusively the product or offspring of another cell." So even here, you have evolutionists having to admit that, because that's true science. And so at least they're willing to go that far. Now, how do you compare that to the one that started this idea, a lot of the ideas of evolutionary theory and belief? That's Charles Darwin. Now, in a letter that Darwin wrote, he makes these suggestions, and this was written in 1871, about life. Even though we've already proven that this spontaneous generation, the law of biogenesis, spontaneous generation is not a true law of science, and the law of biogenesis is. Now, I want you to think about what Charles Darwin had to say. He said that life may have begun in a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, lights, heat, electricity, etc. present. That a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. You know, it's really interesting when you think about it, because even now, even today, you have evolutionists that are going to have to concede to the actual laws of science. They're going to have to admit those. They've been proven. But yet they still hold on to the Darwinistic theories of evolution. So they're really in a battle with all of these beliefs and trying to figure out which one it's going to take. And honestly, to believe in evolution takes more faith than to believe in God. And that's so true. Now, number 4. Evolution contradicts the proven scientific fact of the law of entropy. Again, when you're holding up evolution and you're comparing it to actual proven laws, scientific laws that scientists hold to today, then again, the law of entropy, the first, second law of thermodynamics will certainly show and push you toward a creator, a designer, not evolution. And so when you look at the universal law of decreasing complexity, from order to disorder, complexity to simplicity, we can see this law of entropy as a law of thermodynamics. And if you take burning wood, then it turns to ash. All of these things actually are teaching the opposite of what evolution teaches. Evolution is saying, no, you go from something like a little tiny one-celled amoeba. You're going to go from that to something very, very complex, like the human being with the brain capacity and all of these amazing functions in the human body. You're going to go from a one-celled amoeba to that. That is going from simplicity to complexity, but actually the law of entropy and the law of thermodynamics teaches the opposite. It teaches that where you have that complexity, it's going to go down and move to simplicity. Where you have order, it eventually will move away from that. And evolution teaches the opposite of that. Now, there's a lot of things that we could look at. Time won't allow us. I'm just going to mention them briefly. And for those that are even more interested in digging even further, you can look at each one of these. That is, Earth slowing, the magnetic field decaying, just as erosion wears down. We also know that bodies wear out, decompose. We know that, and machines as well do. Atoms decay to simpler products. Stars exhaust their fuel. And then you look at the nova or the supernova. And when you look at all of these scientific fields that will agree with the laws of thermodynamics, and then you have these other people over here trying to teach you evolution in the same textbooks that contradict those laws. It doesn't make any sense. Why are we still doing this? In Psalm 102, in verse 26, they shall perish, but thou shalt endure. Yea, all of them shall wax old like a garment. As a vesture shalt thou change them, and they shall be changed. All waxing old like a garment, but God endures forever. Especially His Word, as we've mentioned previously. Number 4. Question number 4. And I don't see anybody on our call-in. I still have it open. If anybody wants to jump in and make a comment, you can try to call that number. Let me see if I can give it to you again, if I can pull it up. The number, if you want to call in, you're welcome to. It is 1-351-888-7726. And then you enter in the PIN 186402. Again, I'll give it really fast. 1-351-888-7726. And then the PIN 186402. If you want to call in, you can do that. You can make a comment there. And then I'll try to see if there's any comments up here on our links. Let's see what we got here. All right, we got a couple of people checking in on our Facebook feed saying that they're here, and I appreciate that. Glad you're tuning in. Let's continue on. Question number 4. All right. Doesn't evolution contradict the law of entropy? Yeah, it does. And we need people to ask those questions. If you've been misled into believing this idea, then you need to really seriously think about that. How can an established law of science be contradicted by this weak hypothesis? And why are we still trying to call this thing a fact? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Why are we trying to call evolution a fact? You say, well, people aren't doing that today. Well, yeah, they are. Surely they are. I'll show you. Evolution. Now, this is Stephen Jay Gould. He says evolution is as well documented as any phenomenon in science, as strongly as the Earth's revolution around the sun, rather than vice versa. In this sense, we can call evolution a fact. So, what is it? Wait a minute. We've already shown that this is a theory and certainly not fact. It cannot be tested by the scientific theory. It cannot be called a fact according to science. Is evolution a fact of science? Well, W. Howe says evolution is a fact like digestion. Stephen Jay Gould says evolution is a fact like apples falling out of trees. Richard Goldschmidt said evolution of the animal and plant world is considered by all those entitled to a judgment to be a fact for which no further proof is needed. It's a fact. We don't need any further proof. And that's an intellectually dishonest approach. Certainly we want to look at the evidence, and we will take those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence, and we're not going to say, well, I'm going to believe it, and I don't want any evidence. Don't give me any. Well, that's not very honest. No serious biologist today doubts the fact of evolution. J. Savage says, the fact of evolution is amply clear. We do not need a listing of evidences to demonstrate the fact of evolution any more than we need to demonstrate the existence of mountain ranges. So there are people that are pushing this constantly. And they're going to tell you that you're just not smart. You're not smart if you believe in something other than this organic evolution. The first point to make out about Darwin's theory is that it is no longer a theory, but a fact. No serious scientist would deny the fact that evolution has occurred, and that's Julian Huxley. I want you to think about that. That is the scientific pressure, peer pressure that's being put on individuals that go into the scientific field. And if you go into whatever science, field or branch of science it is, this is the pressure you're going to receive. And so it is very real. They're going to say you can never be anyone that is actually going to get anywhere in your field if you hold to this creation nonsense. If you're going to be really smart and intelligent, you have to accept evolutionary theory. Well, that's false, but that's what they're being told. Now, Richard Dawkins, he says this, it's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. Now, that is against what we would call intellectual bullying. And constantly, even in schools today, it's not supposed to be bullying, but that's exactly what it is. What we're trying to do is point to evidence for why we believe what we believe. And what they're doing is just simply using intellectual bullying. Because there's no way, according to the scientific method, that they can prove, and there's no way that they can really say it's a fact. They can't do that. But they're going to bully you into believing that you've got to be really stupid if you believe that there is a God and you believe in creation. You just cannot be educated. And when you get educated, you will believe in evolution. That is what's being taught. Is evolution a fact of science? Well, a Nobel laureate in physics said this, the pathetic thing is that we have scientists who are trying to prove evolution, which no scientist can ever prove. Now, I want you to think about that. He's right. It's sad that they're trying to set out to prove it when they can't prove it. Not according to the scientific model, the scientific method. It's not possible. And so they're trying to set out to prove it. And they're going to be able to do that. Number two, a nuclear physicist who was writing on Atomic Energy Commission, he says this, scientists who go about teaching that evolution is a fact of life They're great con men. And the story they are telling may be the greatest hoax ever. In explaining evolution, we do not have one iota of fact. It is a tangled mishmash of guessing games and figure jangling. Wow. And so this comes from a scientist who says, by the way, we're making this up. We really don't have any true science behind it, and so he admits this. Also, Paul Davies and Adam Phillips, they say, some scientists say, just throw energy at it and it will happen spontaneously. That it is a little bit like saying, put a stick of dynamite under a pile of bricks and bang, you've got a house. Of course, you won't have a house, you'll just have a mess. And we mentioned that last week and the basic principles of that. So again, it's false. Now, John O'Keefe, who was a NASA astronomer, and he had an interview with Fred Heron. And this is what was stated. We are, by astronomical standards, a pampered, coseted, cherished group of creatures. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in. Now, that's the direction that true science will push an individual toward. When they realize the complexities that exist and try to say, well, that just happened by chance. Oops. Never. They've been trying to create amazing robots and self-driving cars. That stuff just doesn't, it happened. It was an accident. It took a lot of work. And a lot of individuals putting a lot of brain power behind it and a lot of effort to try to make that happen and trying and testing and failing. And eventually they will have something that'll work. But it didn't just poof, spontaneously generate. We haven't spontaneously generated self-flying planes with no pilots to land or to take off. We don't have those things. They didn't, and if we did, they wouldn't have just spontaneously generated. Oh, there it is. No, it doesn't work that way. Frank Tipler, in the Physics of Immortality, says this: when I began my career as a cosmologist, some 20 years ago, I was a convinced atheist. I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would be writing a book purporting to show that the central claims of Judeo-Christian theology are in fact true. That these claims are straightforward deductions of the laws of physics as we now understand them. I've been forced into these conclusions by the inexorable logic of my own special branch of physics. So he's basically saying that in his study, he was forced in this direction based upon his detailed study of physics in his own special branch. Isn't that something? It's amazing. Dr. Paul Davies says this: there is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. You see, true scientists, you're not going to read about these guys in your scientific textbooks in schools or universities because they don't want you to see this information. But there are scientists that when they really dig down and they study, they are led in the direction, pushed toward the truth that there is something behind it all. There is intelligent design that cannot be explained by spontaneous generation or a big bang or an accident, but that it was purposely, intelligently designed. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist at the British Museum, he was giving a speech at the American Museum of Natural History. This is what he said: I think always before in my life when I've got up to speak on a subject, I've been confident of one thing, that I know more about it than anybody in the room because I've worked on it. Well, this time it isn't true. I'm speaking on two subjects, evolutionism and creationism, and I believe it's true to say that I know nothing whatever about either of them. He continues to say, one of the reasons I started taking this anti-evolutionary view, or let's call it a non-evolutionary view, was that last year I had a sudden realization. For over 20 years, I had thought I was working on evolution in some way, and one morning I woke up and something had happened in the night. And it struck me that I had been working on this stuff for more than 20 years, and there was not one thing I knew about it. It's quite a shock to learn that one can be misled for so long. Either there was something wrong with me, or there was something wrong with the evolutionary theory. And naturally, I know there's nothing wrong with me. So for the last few weeks, I've tried putting a simple question to various people in groups. And the question is, can you tell me anything you know about evolution? Any one thing that is true. I asked this question at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. Silence. And you think that you'd be able to talk to these fellow scientists and they would just be able to present the facts? No. That's very sad. Fred Hoyle says this: at all events, anyone with even a nodding acquaintance with the Rubik's Cube will concede the near impossibility of a solution being obtained by a blind person moving the cubic faces at random. Now, imagine 1,050 blind persons, each with a scrambled Rubik's Cube, and try to conceive of the chance of them all simultaneously arriving at the solved form. You then have the chance of arriving by random shuffling at just one of the many biopolymers on which life depends. The notion that not only biopolymers, get that word out, biopolymers, but the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial organic soup here on earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. Anyone that truly goes and starts to dig and study maybe even genetics for that matter, or the cell, or all of the tiny components that make up life, will be soon fascinated at the intelligent design and creation and handiwork of God. And Fred Hoyle says this: the chance that higher life forms have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Is evolution true? Is it false? I don't know. Let me see if I can get my phone to update. And if we have any new information. I don't see any additional comments. All right. I don't see anybody calling in on the number, so I don't guess we have any comments. You're welcome to type away, and I'll make a comment and as best I can. I guess there's always if you really want to make a comment, you can call my number, 256-436, and pick up your bulletin to get the rest. Because I don't want my number out on the internet. So you get your bulletin or your church directory. You can dial my cell phone if you want to make a comment. I'm not going to put it out here on YouTube land because I don't want any telemarketing calls. All right, moving on. Let's see here. There's quite a bit of information that I have, and I'm going to try to pick up on some of this information next time. What I wanted to do is to read just a little bit. Okay, good. We have a comment. I see it popped up. That's good. Hello, everybody out there. All right. So, I have some things that I would like to just peruse, some information I'd like to go through. It's in the book Convicted. Let me see if I can get it over here. Oops. There we go. And let's see if I can put it up in front of the camera. Convicted, Brad Harrod. It's a good book. A lot of really good information in here. And he talks a little bit about the worldviews that are in here and the differing worldviews. But he talks about our duty, and that is to determine whether there is a God or not. I'm going to read a little bit of this, and maybe that this can benefit us in some way. The whole duty of man, and this is on page 16 of Convicted by Brad Harrod, Dr. Brad Harrod. He says, there is no question of greater importance than whether or not God exists. The answer to this single question affects all other questions. If there is a supreme being, then life has inherent purpose and some form of meaning. The very existence of a creator logically indicates that there was a plan that included mankind, and if not, then our very presence on this earth is simply a result of a cosmological explosion. And we are the beneficiaries of climbing our way to the top of that evolutionary tree of life. So without an intelligent designer, humans are the end result of naturalistic changes that have occurred through time. Consider the following position. Number one, only bodies in which a component, that is, the spirit, is eternal and endless, can have meaning. That is, no finite lives have meaning. Number two, if there are no gods, then there are no endless lives. Then if there are no gods, all lives are finite. And number three, if there is no God, then no lives have meaning. That's a sad thought, to think that there are, and really that's the ultimate logical conclusion, is that if I hold to evolutionary beliefs, or atheistic beliefs for that matter, then I don't really have any meaning or really any driving purpose. But as a Christian, as a believer in God, there is absolutely purpose. And there is meaning in life. And there is the value of a human life. And so we know that as a Christian. This meaning does not equate with happiness, as non-believers and believers alike can experience worldly happiness. However, the core meaning for our lives shapes our attitudes and often dictates how we conduct ourselves while on this earth. For many, the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep His commandments, Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 13. For others, the duty of man is to eat and drink and be merry, similar to a 17-year-old that he talks about at the very first of the book. Individuals that are just seeking, that is, the materialistic, fleshly desires of this earth without any real purpose or meaning. He says, my scientific training took place in an atmosphere devoted to naturalism. The notion of anything supernatural was shunned and ridiculed. We were routinely trained that if you could not taste, touch, smell, hear, or see it, then it was not real. Sure, as scientists, we recognize there were things such as love or memory that might exist outside the realms of our normal senses. But we held fast to the notion that, given enough time and the right technology, everything had an explanation that could be traced back to a naturalistic cause. This notion was reconfirmed in textbooks, which strove diligently to give naturalistic explanations for everything. They strove, but routinely they came up short. Naturalism struggled to explain altruism in mankind, the tendency of man to worship, and even the very existence of life and matter. While vague promises were made that the data for these areas would be forthcoming, what did the evidence really reveal about a supreme being? Was science too pre-committed to Darwinism evolution to fairly evaluate the answer to this question? Since this question is the most important, it's the place we have to begin. Before proceeding, take a second to consider the difference, the answer to what the whole duty of man makes for mankind and our offspring. And to answer this question, I want to employ not only scientific skills of observation, but also logic and reason. Then he begins a section where he talks about something from nothing. Any logical person would be hard-pressed to defend that nothing exists today. And that's the truth. I mean, is anybody going to go around and argue, oh, there's nothing here today? Nope. The very fact that you're reading this book or that you're listening indicates that, you know what, something exists. Some might contend that this is all an hallucination, but I would still ask, where did the hallucination come from? And exactly how did you know it was a hallucination? Well, of course, there's no answer to that. In order for something to be acknowledged as a hallucination would mean that one can know reality. So that means there has to be a reality in order to say something's a hallucination. That makes sense. Since it is an absolute truth that something now exists, it demands that something has existed forever. Otherwise, one would be forced to argue that something came from nothing. A position that is weak and illogical. It is a self-evident truth that something cannot come from nothing. Thus, something has to have had existed forever. This truth does not prove a supreme being, but rather it establishes that something has eternal properties. Something does. We haven't said what that is yet, but we just simply say that something has those eternal properties. The essence of being eternal can be defined as existing without a beginning or an end, sometimes considered to be outside of time. And since something exists today, then isn't it reasonable? It is a reasonable scientific observation then to go one step further and deduce that something has existed forever. Since something exists today, then we can say something has existed forever. But how do we go about identifying that something, that eternal something? This is where naturalistic science meets philosophy. All of our scientific observations exclude anything being eternal in nature. Some might argue that the universe holds an eternal potential. And there are some that would argue that given a sufficient length of time, it will reorder itself into the original arrangement without any loss of usable energy. However, the evidence for a theory like this is lacking, and really would be faith-based assumption in and of itself to believe that. Everything that man is currently aware of obeys the second law of thermodynamics, as we've discussed already, which states that the things are running down and wearing out. And this is a concept that is shared by the writers of the Bible. For example, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 11, Isaiah 51 and verse 6, Psalm 102 and verse 26. Eternality would indicate that something is not running down and had no beginning. So let's consider this for a moment. Number one, something exists today, thus something must be eternal. Something had to have always existed. Number two, something is eternal. It doesn't wear down, was not created, though, therefore, something violates scientific laws. That is the second law of thermodynamics. Number three, something violates scientific laws, though something exists outside of observable laws of natural science. And from this, we can conclude that something eternal is thus outside of the observable laws of naturalistic science. While many may not like this math, it's inescapable. And to argue otherwise would be to deny our very existence. We can logically conclude that something has existed forever, something that is not explained by naturalistic science. Now the question becomes, what is that something? What is that something? he begins to go on and he talks a little bit about the Big Bang and the laws of cause and effect, and we've done so. We've talked about that already previously. And then he begins to talk a little bit about worldviews and a little bit about maybe what we would call world religions or worldviews and how that shapes and forms our view of everything as we look through that lens to try to determine the evidence that we see. And he moves through all of that and then goes into the existence of God in his next chapter. So there's some good information there from this particular book that can be beneficial to us